Hi, everyone. Welcome to History on Trial and our long overdue discussion about some of these depictions and what appears to perhaps be social engineering on a very large scale. We're going to be looking at some issues related to depictions in what is supposed to be European art, primarily from the medieval times. We're going to be looking at this because there has been a big concern about the issue of social engineering, particularly since what you have been seeing over time in all of our discussions is this emergence of art, this emergence of history, this emergence of theory that had not been there before. In other words, until recent times, you never saw these depictions. Until recent times, you never heard all of these histories. Now, this is not to suggest that what is emerging is incorrect. What it is to suggest is that there is some social engineering going on, however it is manifesting. One thing that is noteworthy is who is presenting these new depictions. How are they coming about? How are they suddenly appearing in the public eye? One of the reasons that I, in particular, have questions about some of these depictions is because when traveling through Europe, these depictions were not noted. And when the depictions are presented, they are not generally presented as people going through Europe taking pictures of what they are seeing in libraries and museums. What you see is just a depiction, and that just appears on the screen. And it is supposed to be something that has been housed away somewhere in Europe and now suddenly appearing. However, again, these depictions were not noted. I'll give you specific places for consideration. These depictions were not noted in London. These depictions were not noted in Paris, France, including the Louvre and Versailles. These pictures were not noted in Germany. And that's very important because a number of the depictions apparently come from Germany. These depictions were not noted in Amsterdam. And so those are the places that I have done research, and I would have been on the lookout for things like this. And these things were not, just all over the place, the way they appear to be all over the place in terms of the internet right now. Another thing is that when a topic comes up, it appears that there is a plethora of information that suddenly, again, appears on the internet as if it has been there for forever. However, it does not really seem to have been there for forever. And then you have a number of individuals who have a lot of theories that they present as common sense theories, as if people have known these things for forever again. However, these are also new common sense sorts of theories. And this is about everything from, biblical history to European history, African history, Asian history, American history, mythology. You see these things just continue to emerge almost as if out of nowhere. And so there are a couple of things that I would like to address related to some of these depictions, and they have to do with the physical nature of the depictions, the attire of the individuals, the presentation, particularly of what are supposed to be brown male images. There is a common thread running through a number of these depictions that are supposed to be from medieval Europe. And one common thread relates to attire in the male depictions that would stereotypically be attire that would be utilized by those identified as female. And so you see this here with the very fancy dress. Of course, many are going to say that's because they were royalty. Nevertheless, not all royalty are depicted in this manner. So you have with this individual this very ornate dress, and you also have the depiction of the individual with earrings. Now, of course, this is suggestive of a culture that may not necessarily be a European culture, but a transplanted culture. But the question still remains, what are the meanings of these depictions? And what are the implications? And we're going to look at some current depictions also that seem to tie back to this to try to get a better understanding of what is being communicated here in all of these depictions that are just popping up. And here you have NPR in this article uh, related to Code Switch, um, identifying an excuse for why these depictions are not readily available or readily seen when people are traveling throughout Europe. And so the name of the article is Taking a Magnifying Glass to the Brown Faces in Medieval Art. This is back in 2013, according to what's presented here. And so one of the things that the author mentions is all too often these works go unseen in museums, art history classes, online galleries, and other venues because of retroactive whitewashing of medieval Europe, Scandinavia, and Asia. So the question remains, where are the depictions coming from if they are unseen in the museums and they are unseen in the history classes and the online galleries and other venues? Where are these individuals getting these depictions from, and why are these depictions suddenly appearing? And here we have one such depiction. Again, with this attire that is noteworthy, particularly when you're talking about Europe. This person who is the subject or object of this depiction is dressed in a manner that is inconsistent with the location. If you've been to Europe, even in the warmest times, many of these places that are depicted are very cold or cool. And so you have this individual in this depiction that is perhaps inconsistent with just sort of the geographic reality of this place. You also have this depiction that, quite frankly, looks relatively new. There's something about this. I am not an art history buff. This is not my area of expertise. However, when looking at some of these depictions, they just appear to have a flair that appears a little bit more recent than what is purported. Another thing that is noted, if you look to the right, this individual just does not appear to belong in medieval Europe. This just does not fit the history that we know of medieval Europe. Again, it doesn't fit that geography dynamic, that climate dynamic. This, however, looks more like, with the nature of the ornate attire, it looks more like Asia. It looks more like India. Even more so than Africa. This really has a look of Asia. And when you look at the features closely, These features look like the darker features of people who are stereotypically understood as Asian today, as if there is a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, with the phenotype minus the skin color, you have one group of individuals. And then on that same spectrum, you have another group of individuals. So you have the lighter ones on one end of the spectrum and the darker ones on the other end of the spectrum. But if you were able to erase this whole dynamic of skin color and you look at the phenotype, you see that these pretty much are the same people, because many people who are considered stereotypically Asian today, minus the straight hair, have what would be considered Negroid or Negro features. We're talking about the facial shape, we're talking about the nose structure, we're talking about the lips, and also that epicanthic fold you will note in a number of individuals in Africa. The epicanthic fold is pervasive in a number of ethnic groups in Africa, and West Africa specifically, and then also in South Africa. And so you do see that dynamic with the individual off to the right-hand side. And so, of course, this brings into question who really are the people who are in Africa and who really are the people in Asia. Are they basically the same people, almost masquerading as someone different? And that is what it appears to be. And so then you also come over to the Americas, and then you have individuals who are identified as American Indian, and many of them have the same dynamic going on, regardless of skin color. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, particularly because we are addressing the issue of Mr. Japheth. And so, of course, this all touches on Japheth. So we're going to look over to the left-hand side there. You see quite a bit of X marks the spot going on. And so you see the individual who is on this coat of arms heraldry. This individual is depicted as a male, again, darker skin, and the individual is wearing an earring and also has red lips. Again, this dynamic appears to be reminiscent of a person coming out of a culture that is significantly more Eastern versus European. And when you look at some of the historical dynamics related to those individuals who are identified as the descendants of Japheth, you can see where there are these cross-cultural dynamics going on that are being presented as European dynamics, but it appears that there is something else going on, including the solar crown dynamic that you see in both depictions. And so this brings us to the issue of these depictions that are supposed to be European medieval art depictions appearing in other venues. And as mentioned, there's something a bit more Eastern about these depictions than what is suggested when they are purported to be European monarch depictions, European nobility depictions. And if you look to the right, you can see this depiction of an individual who definitely appears significantly more Eastern than European in terms of the attire. You also notice the phenotype and the colored lips and the earrings again. And this individual appears to have what might be locks. It's unclear, it might be a turban. But this individual nevertheless appears substantially similar to, in terms of phenotype, Montero. And so this is something to keep in mind. It's also important to note that Montero often presents wearing earrings. Montero often presents in what would be considered feminized attire, stereotypically feminine attire. And that goes along with some of these depictions that have been presented related to uh, nobility or royalty in medieval Europe. Now we're going to wrap this up, but this is food for thought, particularly since it's important for people to monitor what it is they are taking in, particularly these days. There is a great deal of social engineering going on. There is a great deal of misinformation and disinformation and miscommunication and fabrication of history. So you have the what is known as the whitewashing of history. You also have what might be going on now is the blackwashing of history. And so therefore it's unclear about what history actually happens to be. There is only one truth. You can have a bunch of facts, but you're ultimately only going to have one truth. And it appears that there are a number of facts floating around that are serving to obscure truth. One concern about all of this is that you do have different genetic lines that are clustered together, and they've been identified according to race versus these genetic lines. And these genetic lines are not what you would consider to be historical friends. In fact, they are historical enemies. And even greater than that, some of these genetic lines have been the historic enslavers of other genetic lines. And it seems like, no one is escaping this reality. No one is escaping this history. Everyone has been playing a part in this history. However, there is an apparent rewriting of the history, an obscuring of the history, and changing who might have been the targets and the victims in the history and who may have been the perpetrators. And then you have what appears to be the descendants of the perpetrators pretending to be the descendants of the targeted and the victimized, the enslaved. You have these individuals pretending to be the same thing. You have a lot of identity theft going on. You have a large number of instances of collectives appearing to come together to plan to do things that they have no business doing throughout history, and then pretending that they have no relation to each other, when in fact it appears that they are probably biologically related, and so that might be what the coalitions are all about. However, on the surface they look like they belong to completely different racial groups, and therefore they present as having divergent interests, and that all appears to be part of a social engineering game, a very prolific, cleverly orchestrated social engineering game, but a social engineering game nonetheless. And none of us are above being participants in this social engineering scheme that appears to be going on with respect to history. So remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.